In 1987, Mike Reed left the Saturday Superstore to concentrate on radio and far-right dogma. With him went John Craven to Countryfile, Keith Chegwin to an unfortunate period of obscurity and drinking, Crow, I Expect to Skip, and Vicky Licorice, which incidentally is her real name, to the other side of the camera as a BBC producer. Only Sarah Green remained for the next, and possibly greatest incarnation of the BBC Saturday morning. This time the corporation decided to cast a net wider than Radio 1 and whoever was on the breakfast show, although ironically enough it was Mike Smith, Sarah Green's future husband. This was the first BBC SatAM show created after the birth of children's BBC and the broom cupboard. There was a whole new context for this kind of thing, one where the increasingly creaky Radio 1 DJs didn't fit quite so well. Just as well there was a ready-made replacement.
Can you hear anything? It's not going to happen, is it? Hiya. You alright? The children's BBC goes skidding into the weekend once more, and it looks like we don't have any hammering this afternoon. I can't hear any hammering at all. Got away with it? Good. Right, but let's...
You can use the history of kids' television, at least in the 20th century, as a useful illustrator of how societies loosened up over the decades. From the parental figures of the early days to the fun uncle archetype, introduced by Noel Edmonds with Swap Shop and continued by Mike Reed. By 1987 we lived in an increasingly fast-paced and brightly coloured world of entertainments. Video game arcades, blockbuster movies, noisy military toys with their own advertorial cartoon series. In this world, Mike Reed, with his bizarre voice and his 60s hair and his acoustic guitar, was far too much like your dad. The kids wanted someone closer to their own level by now. The ideal children's presenter had moved on from parental figure to uncle to elder sibling. And the BBC had the perfect big brother, in the good non-totalitarian sense, in the shape of broom cupboard OG Philip Schofield. One could argue that Chris Tarrant and the Tiswas team had fitted the bill a decade earlier, as had Ethel and Company at number 73, but there was still something acting as a separator between them and the viewers at home, a fictional premise or a mental psychosis. The time had come to drop all premises and high concepts, even half-arsed ones, like the Superstore. By the last series of that in 1987, there was very little of it remaining below the title. And just present the show to the audience as a show from the get-go. The new title even reflected this, the somewhat arbitrary Going Live, accompanied by a title sequence themed around the basic concept of live transmission.
This is the BBC television service.
The new, explicitly dynamic theming heralded a much faster-paced experience than the Superstore. The Scof and Sarah Green struck up an instant and enduring rapport, helped no doubt by the fact that they were on a level pegging, unlike the previous two shows which had Noel and Mike very much alone at the head. Those guys had even been visibly older by around 10 years than any of their co-hosts, except John Craven, who was older still, which is why he spent his time sitting around talking about dull subjects like the news. The likes of Green, Chegwin and Licorice were definitely, not maliciously and not noisily, but still definitely of lower rank than the host, or general manager if you must. Not so with Going Live. Schofield and Green were equals. In fact, Sarah was technically the senior partner, both in SatAM experience and simply by being 4 years older. Schofield brought with him from the broom cupboard his enthusiasm, his easy rapport with the camera, his comfort with live television, married to an ability to improvise when necessary, and his puppet sidekick, Gordon the Gopher. A downgrade from Crow, in as much as he didn't speak English, he did at least have more personality. Fortunately, he wasn't the only comic relief. Going Live also featured regular interjections, increasingly so over the years, from a pair of faintly disreputable-looking northern comics called Trev Neal and Simon Hickson. who had already perfected the art of looking like they just wandered into the studio by mistake. They were a not-so-secret weapon, and another manifestation of the evolution of kids' television. After Mike Reed and his guitar and his dad jokes, finally alternative comedy had broken through on Saturday mornings. Trev and Simon quickly became legendary, if not even legendary, as one of the most fondly remembered parts of many people's TV childhoods, myself included. Unburdened by the need to make any sense, and unafraid of going off script or cracking blatant innuendos in an apparent attempt to kill their own camera crew.
And now you are here for 6 long years, and if you should try to escape, heaven forbid, they will come after you and bury you in sand up to your neck and then chop you into little slices!
Slices?
Slices!
That's a great accent you've got there.
Suddenly the BBC's Saturday morning had that unpredictable and faintly menacing element personified a decade earlier by Chris Tarrant. Obviously, compared to the all-out chaos of Tiswas, even Trev and Simon were a party political broadcast on behalf of the Conservative Party. But they were the perfect replacements for the moribund Toxviglus number 73 on the other side. Another innovation in going live was its own game show, Double Dare. Based on the American format that ran on Nickelodeon, it was useful both to keep the pace up, keep the kids watching, and give Green, Schofield and companies 20 minutes off to catch their breath because it was a filmed insert. It was actually quite engaging, and balding Pepperpot Peter Simon was an enthusiastic and likeable host. It also provided the other essential element Tiswas had, to which the BBC had hitherto been resistant: mess. This became even more potent during the 6th and last series of Going Live, when it was replaced, possibly to save money on the licence, with a for legal purposes original variation called Run the Risk, which had a slightly menacing industrial theme and twice as much gunge. It wasn't as good. Actually, that's not fair, it probably was. It's just I didn't like it as much. Partly that's because I was a child and naturally mistrusted change. Partly it was because I preferred the colourful Double Dare set to the darkened scaffolding and crash mats feel of Run the Risk. But I think mostly it was because Peter Simon was demoted to co-host, with Shane Ritchie now the man in overall charge of proceedings. It would get worse, however, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. And of course all the most successful format points were carried over from the Superstore, including the celebrity phone-ins, now instituted as the pulsating climax of every show.
Will I hold what?
Again, it only occasionally proved problematic.
Okay, Elliot, what's your question?
I'd like to ask 5-star where they're so fucking crap, they're fucking...
Thanks very much, Elliot. Nice to hear from you. I'm sure Tammy would have made a lot more sense. Let's move on to line 3. Have you got a sensible question?
In fact, telephone-based interactivity was as big as ever, with the BBC deploying its Archimedes computer technology on a series of games seemingly controlled by the increasingly manic and desperate child on the other end of the line.
Right catch. Left catch. Right catch.
Trust me, this was jaw-droppingly futuristic at the time. So, in a very real sense, we'd never had it so good. From autumn to early spring, anyway. Going live was the compensation for having to go to school the rest of the week. Give us, the nation's children, something that glorious to vegetate in front of during the summer holidays, we'd become fat and indolent and society would surely collapse. Well, either that or even Green and Schofield couldn't keep up the pace year-round. Whatever the case, summer replacements remained very much a thing. More than ever, in fact, as Going Live became appointment viewing, or whatever the hideous phrase is. SatAM in the summertime was, for whatever reason, the responsibility of BBC North West. The mutated remains of Get Set for Summer, in the form of the Saturday Picture Show, had ended in 1986. And the show for the following summer, between the last series of Superstore and the first of Going Live, was in trouble from the title down.
It's wicked.
It's awesome.
It's wicked.
Shades of me, but the weekend fades when the meter's running low. You can't treat your feet to a different street. There's a better place to go.
Hey, it's crucial. Wicked. It's wicked. It's wicked.
Any discussion of It's Wicked could stop at the title, really, although a good word should be put in for Carolyn Marshall's genuinely startling hair. Either one would serve to underline the year of manufacturing blood. Put them together and you have a direct and extremely potent hit of pure, unfiltered 1987. Even at the time it was a bit much. The BBC visibly trying far too hard to be hip and with it and happening, and oh god, what are the kids even saying these days? I mean, it just sounds like nonsense to me. Are they making fun of me or what? I'm just trying to entertain the little bastards. I haven't slept in days. Carolyn and her cohort Jake Abrahams, neither of whom have been heard from since, would show up in that week's location in a bright red 50s Mustang and put up a set that looked like a 50s diner, because 50s kitsch was in at the time, thanks partly to Back to the Future and partly to the 50s being the decade where the tastemakers of the day spent their childhoods and therefore were nostalgic about. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't recommissioned. Instead, the gap between Series 1 and 2 of going live, just to be different, was broken into two. The late spring and early summer was graced with On the Waterfront.
On the waterfront, come and join the fun. 'Cause the party starts right here, yeah. On the waterfront, on the waterfront. Won't you all come down? Be with everyone. We can sing, we can play, we can breathe today. On the waterfront.
This was a very different proposition to what had become the SatAM norm. Presented from Liverpool Docks, hence the name, by latter-day Darren Brown producer and Peep Show co-creator Andrew O'Connor, sex professor Kate Copsick, the late Bernie Nolan, and some bloke called Terry Randall, this combined a light dusting of live music and game show tomfoolery with a handful of cartoons and, the main meat of the show, acres of pre-recorded sketch comedy. I honestly don't remember if it was funny or not. I don't remember laughing much. But either way, it wasn't what I was interested in seeing at that precise time of the week. What I wanted to see was some presenters in a studio talking to T'Pau or something. There was a strange dissonance about On the Waterfront that prevented it from really working, at least for me. Although it did last two series in 1988 and 89. The most famous bits were undoubtedly the redubs of The Flashing Blade, written by Russell T Davies.
By yak, they will keep wallpapering over this door.
Fred!
And in Series 2, The Very Good Car, which coincided with a renewed interest in Gerry Anderson in general. Then, from the height of summer to the dawn of autumn, On the Waterfront stepped aside, in favour of Up to You. And while I do have vague memories of On the Waterfront, I have none whatsoever about Up to You. Apparently it was hosted by Tony Doughty, Jenny Powell and a nascent Anthea Turner, and would involve two of them standing around a stark white set introducing the usual sort of melee, while the other one, whoever's turn it was, wanders the streets of Manchester looking for people to talk at. The title referred to the fact that viewers could call in and suggest subjects or features, or request music videos or whatever. Again it returned the following summer alongside On the Waterfront, but no one really noticed. The most memorable thing about Up to You is undoubtedly that it was the show Anthea Turner was working on when she exploded.
Happened to you
In footage that has appeared in BBC safety videos ever since. Live on the bleeding show, that was.
A few minutes ago, you might have just seen something a bit dangerous happen to Anthea. Just here to say she's okay, she's just gone to first aid and she's going to have a nice hot cup of tea because she's got some shock.
They finally got it mostly right in 1990, with the 8:15 from Manchester.
Manchester, 8:15 from Manchester, 8:15 from Manchester, 8:15 from Manchester.
Apart from the fact that it went out too early, hence the name, this was a solid down-the-line deputy to going live. Presented by Ross King, Charlotte Hindle, and in Series 2, former Simon Mayo weather sex symbol Diane Oxbury. It was the now standard combination of features, games, competitions and a bit of mess, alongside more original features like stern-faced Festival of Judgment in their shoes, and seemingly at random, repeats of Rent-A-Ghost. 80s Rent-A-Ghost, sadly, but still. And it succeeded where its Wicked failed miserably in actually being cool, largely by not trying as hard. Of course, it helped that Manchester was the centre of the culture in 1990. Helped even more that one of the great mank bands of the time, the Inspiral Carpets, provided the theme music. Ultimately, it's mostly notable for not sucking, rather than anything in particular it actually did right itself, apart from the Inspiral's theme. But that's still better than Up to You or its Wicked could manage. ITV looked on with envious eyes. Back in the days of Tiswas, they could claim to be kings of this slot, although not without justified uproar from swap shop loyalists. But at the time, they hadn't realised how important the territory was. Now it had fallen to the BBC, and they were playing catch-up. They still had number 73, but by the time Going Live came along, it was well on the skids. Other formats had been tried. In 1985, Granada made one last attempt at a SatAM show with TX, ready for transmission. Presented by Sue Robbie and Tony Slattery of all people. Remembered by few, fondly so by fewer. It was heavily concerned with music, consisting largely of interviews with and live performances from various synth-pop kingpins of the age. Although undoubtedly its greatest contribution was the first national television exposure for Frank Sidebottom. It also pioneered Going Live's gimmick of a separate game show in the middle, in this case Knock Your Block Off, which was so separate it was made by Central instead of Granada and actually outlived TX itself, despite which I couldn't find so much as a still picture of it, so I've put up a photo of a Satsuma instead. After TX went nowhere fast, Granada withdrew for good. The next summer replacement came from Tyne, a slightly surprising source for a SatAM show, given that they were one of the most resistant stations to the likes of Tiswas, the Mersey Pirate, and even Not Big Daddy's Saturday show. Now here they were, claiming the summer slot as their own for the next decade, and jumping in with both feet with quite dizzyingly contemporary stylings of Get Fresh. Unsurprisingly produced by Janet Street Porter, Get Fresh followed the same roadshow format as its Wicked. It was a useful way of getting around the budgetary constraints of a summer replacement, and the nature of the ITV network meant that the local stations could share some of the burden, not to mention the production credits. The premise, which did still seem to be obligatory, was a sort of proto-Def 2 take on the Saturday Starship. The ship in this case was the Millennium Dustbin, and every week it would touch down on a beach or more often a car park in one of the more unloved ITV regions: Border, Anglia, TSW, HTV, Ulster, and of course its native Tyne. Charlotte Hindle, whose future self we'd already met, presenting the 8:15 from Manchester, was joined by the onyx-mulleted Gaz Top, who would eventually go bold and revert to being Gareth Jones and not a moment too soon, and for some reason Jan Samarco, best known as Adrian Mole. Samarco's a nice chap and all, but he was very much at sea as a live television presenter and left after season 1, making room for Get Fresh's one touch of genuine genius.
Who do you use as a drummer?
Well, we've got our keyboard player, Bubblers, who doubles up.
Pick your nose and touch your toes at the same time, the same time. Pick your nose and touch your toes at the same time.
Instead of hiring a human replacement for Samarco, they contacted Luck and Floor of Spitting Image to produce a snot-coloured, snot-shaped, snot-encrusted chunk of rubber named Gilbert the Alien, easily Get Fresh's breakout star. Voiced by Phil Cornwell, either without a script or simply completely disregarding the very concept of one, Gilbert was the one-being element of anarchy that all SatAM shows really need. In fact, he went beyond anarchy into full-blown Discordian chaos. Dripping KY jelly and babbling a particularly wayward and polluted stream of consciousness, often in a variety of celebrity impressions, Gilbert was one of the most memorable creations to come out of children's ITV in the 80s, if not ever. Cornwell was apparently given absolutely free rein to say absolutely anything he liked at all times, with the sole exception of swear words, of course. And somehow the puppeteers, John Ecclestone and Richard Combs, were able to keep up with him, which is almost more impressive than Cornwell's performance itself. Here's a potent illustration with Gilbert notionally hosting some sort of quiz with Gaz and Charlotte. Gaz has clearly been briefed about something resembling a script involving some creaky old 1,000 jokes for kids material. Cornwell, as Gilbert, clearly couldn't give a flying one and is spinning off at random in a clear attempt to make as little sense as possible.
Okay, here we go. For you guys, I got a question. Yeah. Guys, I've just had something come over my earpiece here, and it's a very important question indeed about football. Why is football so irrelevant?
Has you got anything to do with being long and grey with a trunk at one end and a tail at the other?
Nice try, Gaz. It was, of course, Socrates, the Brazilian skipper, who later turned into a telephone box. But that's something not many people know about.
No, I'm sure they don't.
Get Fresh didn't quite catch on, although its 3 seasons were a pretty decent showing. Gilbert lived on, however, in a pair of his own spin-off series where, freed from both the structure of a Saturday morning magazine show and the need to play second or third fiddle to human co-hosts, he first brought children's programming all the way to the edge of reason and then did the same to the late-night chat show. Jan Samarco is now a paediatric nurse in the East Midlands and no longer acts. Tyne may have lost faith in the Millennium Dustbin, but not in Saturday morning itself, and their next trick was Ghost Train, which combined the ITV Roadshow element of Get Fresh with the narrative premise of Number 73. Unfortunately, it was a stupid narrative premise, involving Francis Dodge inheriting the titular spooky locomotive and... Look, I can't put it better than the show's own press release. With the help of her mates Paul Medford and Sabra Williams, she sneaks it from the grasp of the evil Barry Mafia and makes her escape. Inside is a startled Gerard, the aliens' favourite broadcaster. They are afraid, very afraid, for Barry Mafia is after them. You wonder why they bother, really. Still not the stupidest premise a SatAM show ever had, though. But close. Anyway, Ghost Train was watchable enough, mostly notable for its own puppet co-presenter, for whom Tyne went back to Luck and Flaw and asked them for something less disgusting and more ovine. Nobby the Sheep was no Gilbert. At least 94% of what he said made sense. But he was likeable enough, and certainly more interesting than Crow from the Superstore. I even preferred him at the time to Gordon the Gopher, only because he spoke English. Meanwhile, ITV's main SatAM slot was vacant. Number 73, or rather 7T3, which didn't even make sense, goddammit, had finally died in the dirt. The Light Channel was in the market for a new mainline series, and it had to be a good one, because going live was the stiffest competition they'd yet faced. For whatever reason, if any, it fell to TBS to replace their own show. So, they looked at what had gone wrong with Number 73, and they looked over at going live on the BBC, and they decided to see what they could learn. The new show was called, for reasons that were never really made clear, Motormouth. Neil Buchanan and Andrea Arnold were retained from the previous show, now explicitly as themselves, and with the latter finally given her feet back. All premises having mercifully been dropped in favour of just presenting a show, just as the BBC were doing. Well, almost. Not wanting to let go of the Number 73 narrative business altogether, TVS hedged their bets and created the spin-off. A filmed insert purportedly depicting the making of the show behind the scenes, starring Roger Sloman, a tiny Joe Greco, and a bunch of other people. It mostly confused and irritated the viewing public, which I don't think was the intention. Back in the real show, alongside Neil and Andrea, were Tony Gregory, Julian Ballantyne, and Caroline Hanson, none of whom were ever heard from again. They were now safely back indoors in the Maidstone studios in a cavernous black space dotted with inflatables and tubes and all sorts of proto-cyberpunk techno-industrial decor in a desperate attempt at a contemporary look. And therein was the problem. Like It's Wicked before it, Motormouth sweated blood to be trendy and with it and now. And like It's Wicked, it failed miserably. Underneath all the tubing and scaffolding and inflatable mouths and hyper-contemporary age of chance graphic design lay a standard magazine show that really could have benefited from being able to breathe free of its own aesthetic. Few preferred it to going live, and it failed to do any great harm to the BBC show in the ratings. Perhaps surprisingly, it was brought back for a second series, explicitly billed on screen as Motormouth 2, although I don't think anyone ever said it out loud. The set was brightened up and made more going live-ish. In fact, the whole thing was made more going live-ish, complete with phone-in interviews and a guns-equipped game show segment presented by incomprehensibly energetic pop-eyed irritant Steve Johnson. Oh, and Spin-Off was dropped. A young Gabby Roslin gradually replaced Andrea Arnold, who as it turned out didn't much enjoy presenting as herself without wheels. But she's won an Oscar, so who cares? And Motormouth started to build something resembling an audience. It was still never going to beat going live at this rate, however, so as the 90s dawned, TVS decided to retool almost the whole show. The whole motif of a motorised mouth was by and large thrown out the window, apart from the startling opening shot of the new titles, in favour of a vague sort of diner type arrangement and a new aesthetic called CGI robots and pastel colours. There was a new host in Andy Crane, with TBS finally having learned Going Live's greatest lesson of all and poached its presenter from the broom cupboard. Buchanan and Roslin stayed on alongside him, and Motormouth finally began to grow the ability to stand on its own 2 feet. By the fourth series in 1991 and 92, the first not to have been retooled, it was a serious competitor to the BBC show, and was even winning the ratings battle on the odd occasion in early 1992. Of course, that series of Going Live was the one without both Trev and Simon, for reasons never really made clear, and, for large chunks, Philip Schofield, because he was off doing Joseph and his amazing Technicolor derp coat in the West End. Still, it's hard to imagine 73 or TX, or even the first version of Motormouth proving themselves preferable even to a crippled Going Live. So TBS were quite rightly pleased with themselves. Right up until they lost the franchise.